Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. Today, we'll cover the recent Singapore Airlines turbulence incident and the recent uptick of violence against Rohingya in Myanmar.
We'll also discuss a proposed ban on investigative journalism and LGBTQ content in Indonesia and the Philippines' new Luzon corridor. I'm Lauren Mai.
And I'm Japhet Kitson. Today is May 30th, 2024. On this week's conversation,
this is certainly more churn than we've seen, with 6 Politburo members losing their job, 2 presidents losing their job, the head of the National Assembly losing his job, a senior female member of the Politburo being ousted. It's pretty dramatic.
Greg was joined by Murray Hiebert to discuss the latest political developments in Vietnam. Before that, let's start with our headlines. We're starting today's podcast on a more somber note.
Yes, we certainly are. Last Tuesday, a Singapore Airlines flight carrying 211 passengers and 18 crew members hit sudden severe turbulence while flying from London to Singapore.
1 passenger died of a suspected heart attack and dozens more were injured, including at least 9 Malaysians, 2 Singaporeans, and 1 Filipino.
After making an emergency landing in Bangkok, victims were treated in the ICU at Samitiwait Sinakaran Hospital.
The hospital said that several people will need spinal surgery.
Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong called his counterpart in Thailand, Sita Thavisin, on Tuesday to thank the Thai government for their support and assistance during this tragedy.
Singapore also sent officers from its Transport Safety Investigation Bureau to Bangkok to investigate the incident. As the incident involved a Boeing aircraft, the U.S. is also sending representatives and technical advisors to support the probe.
Let's hope for swift recovery for victims and for answers to come from this investigation.
For our next story, let's look at Myanmar, where fighting in the western state of Rakhine have put thousands of Rohingya who live in the area at increased risk.
An ethnic armed organization in Myanmar, the Arakan Army, has captured Butidang, a town where many Rohingya have sought shelter from violence since 2017.
The Arakan Army, or AA, has ordered Rohingya to evacuate the downtown area, allegedly using threats and violence.
This has included an attack on a school and a hospital where many Rohingya were seeking refuge, resulting in numerous injuries and fatalities. Regardless of blame, the recent violence highlights how the Rohingya are targets on 2 fronts of a country embroiled in civil war.
Now, AA is stepping up its offensive to capture the border town of Mang Dao, which is also home to a large Rohingya population.
The Myanmar junta will likely attempt to hold the town, which may cause a serious expansion of violence.
The humanitarian crisis is being compared to the height of violence against the Rohingya in 2017, which the United States and the United Nations consider to be a genocide.
UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, has called on the AA and the Myanmar military to stop fighting and allow humanitarian organizations to access the area.
UNHCR also reported that 50 Rohingya Muslims arrived in Indonesia's North Sumatra province last Thursday. The violence is certainly complicating ASEAN's recent efforts to provide humanitarian aid to Myanmar, now 3 years after the 2021 coup.
Our third story looks at Indonesia, where civil society groups and filmmakers are sounding the alarm over a proposed change to Indonesia's broadcast law.
A bill seeks to ban content displaying, quote, violence, mysticism, LGBTQ, or negative behavior or lifestyles that could potentially harm the public, end quote.
Critics say that the ban would impede the creativity of the creative industry, freedom of press, and people's autonomy to decide what they want to watch.
Journalists are also expressing concern that they will no longer be able to reveal stories on corruption, nepotism, and environmental crimes, which is an impediment to democratic accountability in the world's 3rd largest democracy.
Not exactly the best 2 weeks for Southeast Asia, huh?
Unfortunately not. But there is one hopeful development we should discuss.
Absolutely. For our final story today, we're looking at the new Luzon economic corridor in the Philippines.
Last Tuesday, the United States, Philippines, and Japan held the first steering committee meeting about the new corridor on the sidelines of the Indo-Pacific Business Forum in Manila.
Announced last month at the U.S.-Philippine-Japan Trilateral in Washington, the joint project is set to develop modernized ports, railways, clean power projects, and supply chain improvements in the Philippines.
The corridor is set to include 3 initial projects.
First, $868 million Subic-Clark Railway to connect Subic Bay, Freeport Zone, and the Clark Freeport and Special Economic Zone in central Luzon.
Second, the construction of a second runway and other essential facilities at Clark International Airport, valued at $174 million.
And third, the development of a $152 million, 64-hectare Clark National Food Hub to boost the local agricultural sector.
If these projects come to fruition, the Luzon corridor could drive economic growth and improve connectivity between Subic Bay, Clark, Manila, and Batangas.
The corridor and the recent meeting are being touted by Washington as a demonstration of commitment to its relationship with Manila and with IPEF partners.
Right. After all, the new corridor is the first major deliverable for the PGII project in Southeast Asia. PGII, or the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, is a G7 initiative many consider to be a response to China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Notably, the new corridor comes after the Philippines said last year that it would no longer pursue Chinese loans to fund 3 projects.
Clearly, there's a lot riding on the US and its partners to deliver on these new investments.
And those are the headlines. Did we miss anything? Be sure to write us about the topics that you're interested in at searadio@csis.org, and we'll be happy to cover them.
We're also putting together some questions from you all to chat about in our upcoming Southeast Asia Radio special anniversary episode. Send us your questions.
Looking forward to hearing from you all. Coming up, Greg's conversation with Murray Hiebert. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to another episode of Southeast Asia Radio, everybody. As always, I'm Greg Poling with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Today, flying solo in the hosting duties because Elena Noor is tied up with more important matters at the place that actually pays her salary. But today, we're joined by a very special guest and a longtime colleague of mine, Murray Hiebert. Murray is a non-resident senior associate with CSIS. For many years was the deputy director of the Southeast Asia program here at CSIS, and was the man foolish enough to give me a job at CSIS some 12 years ago. So Murray, thanks so much for this and all of that.
Welcome.
For those who, I think, understandably have had trouble tracking what's happened over the last year or so in Vietnam, we've had, as you said, 2 presidents. So former President Nguyen Xuan Phuc was forced to step down late last year. That followed the resignation of 2 other Politburo members who had gotten caught up in COVID-era financial scams, the repatriation scandal and the test kit scandal. Nguyen Xuan Phuc's family may or may not have been involved in a corruption scandal that had brought him down, although the party's been very cagey in the specifics for these top leaders when they resign. They usually just get labeled as having violated, party discipline without further specifics. Then Phuc was briefly replaced with Vo Van Tung. Vo Van Tung himself was then forced to step down, along with the head of the National Assembly, Vuong Tinh Huê. So that's 2 of what Vietnam usually calls the 4 pillars, the 4 top leaders, which is the prime minister, the party secretary, the president, and the National Assembly chair. And then we get, along with some plenty of other lower level officials caught up in this anti-corruption campaign, the Blazing Furnace. And finally, over the last week, we start to get people replacing these. So now we have Public Security Minister To Lam stepping into the presidency. There was a little bit of drama earlier this week. So we're recording on May 22nd, about a week before folks who are going to listen to this, in which it seemed that To Lam might remain dual-hatted as Public Security Minister and President. That seems to no longer be the case. He's going to give up the Public Security Ministership and just take up the presidency. And then we have a replacement for Huê with Tran Thanh Minh taking over as the National Assembly chair, and the elevation of more members to what had become a very thin bench on the Politburo. I mean, I think there was a lot of concern that there just weren't enough people left to fill these positions if they kept knocking out Politburo members, particularly enough people who would be under the mandatory retirement age when the next party Congress comes around in 2026. I don't expect people to necessarily memorize all that litany of change, but it's really been kind of a turnover in the Politburo. So we brought Murray on to talk Vietnam. I don't think anybody in D.C. knows Vietnam better or has probably a longer history and experience with Vietnam, among many other things. Murray wrote a book about Vietnam when did you publish the first book, Murray? It was long before Washington's current love affair with Vietnam, right?
1996, I think.
Okay, 96. So we were, still in the early days of normalization, when most Americans probably didn't realize that we were normalizing ties with Vietnam. So you've got a lot of history there. Is it safe to say that the political churn we've seen in Hanoi over the last few months is unique in your long exposure with Vietnam?
Yeah, this is certainly more churn than we've seen, with 6 Politburo members losing their job, 2 presidents losing their job, the head of the National Assembly losing his job, a senior female member of the Politburo being ousted. It's pretty dramatic. The other time when there was quite a bit of uncertainty was in 1986 when they had, I think it was the Fifth Party Congress, and that changed the direction of Vietnam's economy from a very centrally planned sort of socialist kind of state planning economy to a much more free market. That was a transition, but it took some time till they achieved this, but at that point they elected a party chief who had not been considered in the running and a serious challenge. Nguyen Van Linh was his name.
What do you think of what this says about 2026 and the jockeying for the next party Congress when it's widely expected that the most powerful man in the country, Nguyen Phu Trong, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, is going to have to step down, given that he will be, I think, 81 in 2026, and every faction is looking for his job.
Yeah. So the turmoil has been, I think, for two reasons. One is an attempt to stamp out or to remove some of the corruption that is plaguing the party, which is really pretty bad. Vietnam is often rated pretty low in the Transparency International. It's number 83 out of 180, I think, which is lower than China. So there is a clear need to address corruption, but just firing people doesn't necessarily address corruption. And so it is not done through sort of legal channels, meaning using the court system, but rather by the party apparatus itself, which can, of course, mean that you start taking out some of your opponents. That's the other thing that's going on in this campaign. It is a jockeying to get ready for 2026, which, as you said, Nguyen Phu Trong he is already finishing his third term. He's the first one to ever do 3 terms, third party chief to ever do 3 terms. And he is the first one to ever do that. And he is not that healthy. And so to have him continue, which is, of course, an option if they can't come to a resolution and pick somebody, would really leave the party in a bit of a weakened position. It would raise questions about stability and continuity and some of those issues. So the party Congress is going to be a really big deal in 2026.
And aside on Chum, one of the side stories this week was Chum's reappearance in public at the National Assembly session after he had missed national holiday celebrations a couple weeks ago. I think that's only maybe the 4th time he's been seen in public since last fall. He appeared briefly with President Biden during his visit. He greeted Xi, and then I think he had one other public appearance. But he's become so, I guess, crucial in everybody's eyes as the only linchpin holding this together, given the churn that every time he's out of the public eye, given his poor health for longer than a couple of weeks, the rumor mill spins up. And it really speaks to, while Vietnam remains a leadership by consensus of these 4 pillars, because of the churn, he's become just unusually central to, I think, everybody's perception of stability within the system. Is that also unusual in your experience for a general secretary to be so kind of singularly seen as the bastion of stability?
He is the general secretary, who is always a he, is viewed as, yes, a first among equals. And Nguyen Phu Trong certainly is the first among equals. But the fact that he can't show up is a challenge. And there had been talk before Biden visited last year to announce the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership that Party Chief Trump would actually come to Washington, but they could not arrange that. And that's what prompted Biden to try to go there. Yeah, and he doesn't show up very regularly, and they have to schedule foreign visitors around his availability, meaning when he's got enough strength to ultimately show up for these meetings. And so if he is so pivotal to the whole system, not the only one, obviously the president when you have one, and the prime minister could also fill in for some of these roles, but it's a little bit like coming to the United States and only meeting the vice president rather than the president. And so, yes, foreign visitors are noticing this, but also Vietnamese are noticing this. And there is concern even could something happen to him ahead of the first quarter of 2026 when the next party Congress is scheduled?
Do you think it's fair to say that To Lam has emerged now as the most powerful potential successor ahead of 2026, given that he's now acceded to the presidency, and as Minister of Public Security, he had at least some leading role in directing the anti-corruption investigations that have brought down so many other officials?
He may be the leading candidate, but it is very interesting that he wanted to stay on as head of the Ministry of Public Security, and he was not allowed to. He then proposed that one of his several deputies would be allowed to, and they didn't agree to this. So I think that, yes, he has created some enemies. He has files on absolutely everybody. And he was the spearhead of the corruption campaign and identified those people that were finally ousted. So there is some concern in Vietnam that he would continue doing this as a party chief if he had the singular most important authority. And that, there's some people have even used the word that he could turn the country into a police state. That's a little bit tough terminology, but he really only has public security experience. He started his work career in that ministry. And really, Vietnam, he's not that experienced in diplomacy, although he has visited the United States, he visited the UK, he's visited China. And when Biden met with him, with Party Chief Trump in last September, To Lam was sitting immediately to Trump's left, which people saw as pretty significant. But he doesn't have experience in diplomacy and economic policy, as I mentioned. And, Vietnam is very busy trying to have this, what people are now dubbing bamboo policy, where it tries to balance the U.S. and China, where it tries to make friends with Japan, the EU, Australia, and France, et cetera, and economic policy is very critical for Vietnam. It is probably the biggest beneficiary of the sanctions and tariffs put on China. So having experience in the economy is really very important. Nguyen Phu Trong did not have that, but he had strong people in other positions. And he eventually became quite a strong supporter of economic trade and investment. And he actually became a strong supporter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which when he was visiting in 2015, he made that very public, visiting the U.S. in 2015. And ultimately, it was the U.S. under President Trump that pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So Lam has some strikes against him. He's very powerful, but there are some concerns about whether inside Vietnam, about whether he would be the right guy.
If we look ahead to 2026, or maybe even before, over the next 2 years, there's often this binary narrative spun out about factions within the Communist Party of Vietnam, that you have the security guys or the party discipline crowd versus the reformists, the pro-business types. Is often divided between kind of party officials and government officials. And maybe there was a degree of truth to this if we go back to over a decade now, when Chom defeated Nguyen Thanh Xuom to become the general secretary. And Xuom was largely seen as the modernizer, the pro-business government guy, and fell to this dogged Marxist-Leninist who believed in party discipline and cracking down on the excesses of capitalism. But as you said, Chom has become a proponent of foreign direct investment and engagement with the West. He's the one who clearly greenlit the Communist Strategic Partnership. The current Prime Minister, Pham Minh Chinh, also came out of the Public Security Bureau. He now spends most of his time, it seems, going around the country demanding that highways and railroads get built faster for foreign investment. So as we try to look through the straw, into this very tiny aperture we have on the CPV, do you think there actually still is these kind of clear ideological divisions between factions, or is it more accurate to just view this as personalities struggling to come out on top ahead of 2026?
Oh, it is personalities for sure, but it is also people with different emphases. I don't know if it's accurate to call them factions, but you could probably use factions in inverted commas. So there are people in the security apparatus that are very concerned about color revolutions. We thought these were gone for the last decade or so, but no, they're still well and alive. Every once in a while, when a senior official of the Ministry of Public Security makes a speech, they refer to the color revolution threatening Vietnam, and they do refer to sometimes that some of the U.S. policies and U.S. NGO policies could result in some threat. However, there is the other side that's really pushing on economics, and the leadership knows that a little bit like China, your legitimacy is tied to economic growth, improving people's livelihoods. And so, I think that people, even the public security focused people, recognize that economic development, investment, trade, reform, transparency is all quite important. So it is a bit of a struggle, but it's a little bit like a struggle in a U.S. Democratic administration like we have now. You have people much more focused on, some are very focused on China, or some are very focused on economic growth. And so there's different emphases rather than hardline factions that are duking it out, I think.
So what do you hear from the business community, the foreign business community, when it comes to concerns about stability? Are they worried about the churn? Are they worried in general about the Blazing Furnace anti-corruption campaign and the chill it seems to have had on approvals of projects across the board?
So there is concern, and they are watching this carefully. Interestingly, foreign direct investment increased by over 7% in the first quarter of this year, which is interesting because this burning furnace was burning already during those months. And we do have this, when Biden went there, the big emphasis on helping Vietnam get into the global supply chain, help them to get into semiconductors, helping them get more training for engineers, that kind of emphasis. And that's still going on. But officials, U.S. officials will say privately that it's hard to get Vietnam today to implement some of the tentative projects they had outlined last September. There's very slow movement on these, and they wonder what it's due to. And some really do link it to the fact that officials are quite concerned that if they make a move with regard to a U.S. project or make a move approving some foreign investment project or expansion of an existing project, that they may be viewed as having received a kickback or some benefit personally for themselves or their families. So there is a concern that this is starting to have an impact. But you're still seeing a recent survey of Japanese business said that the U.S. was their favorite market and Vietnam was their second favorite market for investment. So it's really kind of interesting how favorable Vietnam is. Of course, you have to judge Vietnam against itself, but it also has neighbors. In Thailand, it's trying to move toward democracy, but some of the economic policies have been very slow under the military junta until we had the new government. But to get the civil service to get going is slow. Same with Indonesia. It's a little bit protectionist, more than a little bit protectionist. And it also creates problems for foreign investors. So Vietnam is not alone in the region with creating some headaches for foreign investors. But yes, the burning furnace is slowing things down for sure.
I mean, undeniably, Vietnam is the first country in the region that comes to mind when you talk to U.S.-based companies and European companies about where they're looking outside of China and maybe India. I suppose it's now probably playing second fiddle to India. And it's still, as you said, outcompeting Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, even though Philippines is probably going to have a slightly faster GDP growth this year. But we're also, we're seeing a clear problem with absorptive capacity. The energy shortages have become a massive problem. The unplanned blackouts last year if you're going to attract major semiconductor fabs, you can't shut down a fab for 12 hours unannounced out of nowhere. Same with water shortages, transportation, bottlenecks are becoming a huge problem. And all of that requires billions of dollars of investment. And yet you've got, $15 billion from the U.S. and partners out there with the Just Energy Transition Partnership. Not a penny's been spent yet. You've got, I saw Reuters reporting on a letter from the World Bank and the UN that they had to take back $2.5 billion earmarked for Vietnam because the funds expired. They were never spent, and there's another billion waiting. So I wonder if Vietnam is kind of running out of time here to get ahead of these bottlenecks that might start taking the shine off the apple a little bit. And whether or not, if this finally settles the churn at the top level, if that begins to ease up, or if companies are just going to have to wait until after 2026 for the bureaucracy to stop being afraid of its own shadow so much.
Yeah. And then also domestic spending is down. In 2023, Vietnam spent a little bit less than 2/3 of its capital investment funds in the government budget, which also is assumed to be related to the fact that nobody wanted to make decisions. Yes, electricity is a problem. Some companies have already been told in recent days that they may have to cut back the amount of electricity they get, in addition to what they faced last year. And yes, a lot of companies now, U.S. companies that are listed companies, have increasing pressure from shareholders to use clean energy. And like you mentioned, the Just Be project is moving slowly. And then, depressingly enough, 6 of the most active climate change enthusiasts in the NGO community are in detention for various alleged tax evasion. And I suspect it's because they were pushing the government a little bit too hard. But the government really needs nudging on clean energy, because not only is it short of energy, it's also very short in clean energy, which will make it difficult. We had Tim Cook of Apple visit a few months ago. We had the head of NVIDIA visit the chip manufacturing outfit. And if these guys don't get clean energy, they ain't coming to Vietnam.
One other big question for the U.S. in particular is always trying to guess at the foreign policy proclivities of these leaders, and particularly when it comes to who feels most sympathetic to the U.S., China, Russia. Do we have any sense of what the leadership transition, to Lam's elevation of president, and the coming party Congress in 2026 might mean for the direction of foreign policy?
There is some speculation out there, which you've no doubt seen, that this will mean Vietnam is going to move closer to China. Vietnam has also, even when they signed the new comprehensive strategic partnership with the U.S., has concerns about the U.S. Vietnam is trying desperately not to go one way or the other. And I don't think the party with Nguyen Phu Trong still in charge for the next year and a half, they're not going to move closer to China. They recognize China is wildly unpopular in Vietnam. There were huge protests in 2014, 2018 against China for actions in the South China Sea. There's been considerable discontent since China tried to redraw the lines, the baselines in the Gulf of Tonkin about 2 months ago. The history, even between the communist parties, is very tense. And that will not go away. However, two parties look to each other to survive, even though they have a considerable distrust of each other. And the same with the U.S. The U.S. is going to help. It's the biggest trading partner, a serious investor. Vietnam will keep looking to the U.S., but it's trying to find alternatives to get Japan and EU and others to play a more important role. But I think you're going to see the bamboo diplomacy, the multipolar kind of focus of Vietnam continue. Officials are going to balance each other out on that. Vietnam cannot afford to alienate the United States right now, and it also can't afford to alienate China. Needs both of them.
Great. Well, Murray, thanks so much for joining us. And thanks for giving me a job. Anybody who didn't like this or any other podcast, feel free to send your complaints to Murray. At the end of the day, it's his fault. That's all the time we have for this episode. We'll be back in another 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.
Great. Thanks, Greg. And do not send me complaints about Greg. He's to blame for his own mistakes by now. Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at searadio@csis.org, and we'll get back to you.
Do us a favor and subscribe and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever streaming platform that you listen to us on. Tell your friends about us.
Marla Hiller is our producer, and our intern is Taffy Lung. Our host today was Greg Poling. My name is Japhet Kitson.
And I'm Lauren Mai.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.